A retired Navy SEAL was driving toward a quiet piece of land when something in the snow made him slam on the brakes. In the ditch, a man was beating a mother dog while she tried to shield her newborn puppy. And that tiny puppy looked up at him with the kind of fear no living thing should ever carry. Brady thought he was leaving the world behind that day. He had no idea that one moment on a frozen roadside would change the rest of his life. Because before the winter was over, that helpless little dog would lead him straight into something bigger than mercy. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story stays with you, please like and subscribe as we journey toward 1,000. Brady Ryan left the Navy in early winter. The kind of northern winter that did not begin with drama, but with a quiet tightening of the world. The air grew sharper. The light turned thin and white. Fence posts wore caps of snow. Streams ran darker under shelves of ice. By the time he crossed into the northern part of Wisconsin with a truck bed full of tools, lumber chains, 2 fuel cans, and the last pieces of a life he did not care to explain, the season had settled in for good. At 35, Brady stood a little over 6 feet, built like a man who had spent more years carrying weight than showing it off. His body was lean and hard in the practical way of endurance rather than vanity. He kept his face shaved clean, his jaw square, his cheekbones sharp enough to catch the winter light. His dark brown hair was cut short in the old military habit, though it had grown just beyond regulation now, enough to show he no longer belonged to anyone's chain of command. His skin was fair under it all, but wind and cold had roughened it. His eyes were gray-blue, steady and watchful, the kind that made people think twice before filling silence with nonsense. He had bought a small piece of land beside a creek because he wanted one thing and one thing only: distance. Not from work, not from hardship. Those never frightened him. He wanted distance from explanations, from well-meaning questions, from the polite burden of being known. The place had no grand house on it, only a rough utility shed, a stand of birch and pine, and a clear stream that cut through the property on its way south. That was enough. He would build a cabin, split wood, sleep when he could, and answer to weather instead of people. The road ran through a corridor of birch trees, so pale they looked almost blue against the snow. Sunlight flashed off the drifts hard enough to sting the eyes. Brady drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders loose, mind quiet for once. It was the sort of silence he had imagined when he signed the papers. Then he rounded a bend and hit the brakes so hard the truck fishtailed slightly before catching. At first it looked like a pile of torn canvas and dark brush thrown into the ditch. Then it moved. A man stood near the roadside in a heavy work jacket, boots spread wide in the slush, one hand gripping the handle of a square shovel. At his feet lay a German shepherd, a female, black and tan under the mud and snow, though too thin to hold any real shape. She tried to rise and could not. The man swung the handle down across her ribs with a flat, ugly sound. Something small twitched beside her. Brady saw the puppy then. It lay on a soaked piece of blanket stiff with cold, so tiny it barely looked finished. A few days old at most. Its fur was still more softness than coat, dark along the back, lighter at the sides. It should have been pressed into warmth, tucked under a mother's chest, hidden from the wind. Instead, it was shivering in open air, making no sound at all. Brady pulled the truck onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The world outside seemed too bright for what was happening in it. Snow banks, birch trunks, clean sky, and that man standing over a dying dog as if cruelty were just another chore to finish before noon. When Brady opened the door, the cold struck hard. So did the smell. Wet dirt, gasoline, animal fear. The man turned. He was in his 40s, maybe, broad through the middle with a red face and pale eyes that had gone mean from long practice. He looked at Brady the way a man looks at a stranger who has interrupted something he thinks he has the right to do. "Keep driving," he snapped. "Not your business." Brady stepped down from the cab without hurrying. His old olive tactical shirt was faded at the shoulders and cuffs. His moss green combat pants were worn white at the knees. Everything about him looked used, broken in, lived through. There was nothing theatrical in the way he moved. That made him more dangerous, not less. The German shepherd tried to drag herself over the blanket again, not to flee, to cover the puppy. Then the puppy lifted its head. Its eyes were barely open all the way, wet and glassy, and they found Brady with the kind of helpless focus that stopped him colder than the air did. It did not bark. It did not cry out. It only looked at him as if some small blind part of it had already decided he was the last thing left in the world to look toward. That look went clean through him. Later, Brady would not remember crossing the road. He would remember the puppy's eyes and the sudden knowledge that if he got back into his truck and drove on, those eyes would go with him into every quiet place he ever tried to build. The man lifted the shovel handle again. "Put it down," Brady said. His voice was low, even, no anger in it. That seemed to unsettle the man more than shouting would have. "She's mine," the man barked. "Wild thing won't feed right. Not worth. Put it down." For a moment, the two men stood in the white glare, facing each other. Then something in Brady's expression must have registered, because the man let the handle dip an inch. "My place is just over that ridge," he said, trying for swagger and landing somewhere closer to spite. "You don't know what." Brady moved then, fast and clean. One hand caught the shovel shaft, a twist, a step. The man lost his grip with a curse. Brady sent the tool skidding into the snowbank and drove him back with one hard shove to the chest. Not a beating, not revenge, just enough force to make the boundary plain. "You touch them again," Brady said, "and the next stop won't be a clinic." The man stared at him, breathing hard, measuring and failing. "Name's Kurt Danner," he muttered. "You'll regret this." Brady did not answer. Kurt backed away, swearing under his breath, then trudged toward an idling work truck farther up the road. His tires sprayed slush when he pulled off. Only when the sound faded did Brady kneel. Up close, the mother dog was worse than he had thought. She was perhaps 5 years old once, maybe less, but hunger and pain had carved the age wrong into her. Her black and tan coat was matted thin along the flanks. Old scars crossed one shoulder. One ear bore a ragged split. Her breathing came shallow and uneven. There were fresh welts along her side, but the deeper damage had been done long before Brady arrived. "Easy," he said softly. She showed him her teeth, not in fury, but in exhausted warning. One more inch, and she would have spent the last of herself trying to stop him from touching the puppy. Brady took off his gloves and let her smell his hand. After a moment, the growl died in her throat. He lifted the puppy first. It was shockingly light, barely warmer than the air around it. Tiny heartbeat fluttering too fast against his palm. When he tucked it inside his jacket against his chest, it made the faintest sound, less a cry than a broken breath. Then he slipped his coat blanket from behind the seat, wrapped the mother as carefully as he could, and carried her to the truck. She did not resist. She only kept turning her head, searching until he laid the puppy where she could see it. The veterinary clinic sat outside a small town 20 minutes away, attached to what looked like an old dairy building converted by necessity rather than money. Brady carried the puppy in first, then went back for the mother. Dr. Eliza Boone met him at the door before he had spoken more than 3 words to the receptionist. She was 38, slender and straight-backed, with dark chestnut hair pulled low and practical hazel eyes that took in damage quickly without wasting movement on surprise. She wore a quilted green jacket over gray layers and winter boots dusted with sawdust from somewhere in the back. "What happened?" "Roadside," Brady said. "Male shepherd, newborn pup, abuse." That was enough. She turned and called for warm towels, formula, heat packs. Reality changed shape inside that room. There was no room for righteous anger once work began. The puppy had to be warmed slowly, fed carefully, monitored every few minutes. The mother was another matter. Eliza ran practiced hands over broken places, infection, scar tissue, swelling that spoke of older beatings and untreated damage. After a long moment, she looked up at Brady. "This didn't start today," she said quietly. "Today was just the part you saw." Those words settled hard. Around the 2/3 mark of that afternoon, when the sun had shifted and the clinic windows glowed white instead of gold, Brady had his first real chance to leave. Eliza had the puppy stabilized for the moment. The mother was sedated and breathing. The road to his new land was still open. He could have told himself he had done enough. But when Eliza lifted the puppy for another feeding, the little thing stopped shivering only when his hand rested near its side. Brady looked at that and felt something inside him move in a direction he had not asked for. Not hope. Not yet. Responsibility. Night came early. The mother dog surfaced once near dusk. Brady was standing beside the steel exam table when her eyes opened. They were dark brown, clouded by pain, but still sharp enough to find the puppy in the warmed crate first. Then they shifted to him. It was not trust. Trust was too clean a word for that moment. It was something rougher, sadder. The look of a creature that had held the line alone for too long and had finally run out of body before running out of will. Brady did not reach for her. He only stood there and said, "I've got him." Her gaze stayed on him 1 second more. Then it left. She died while the snow outside the window still reflected the last of the daylight. Brady took her back to the land the next morning in the bed of his truck, wrapped in the same blanket. The creek ran dark under shelves of ice. Sunlight laid thin across its surface like tarnished silver. He chose a rise above the water where birch roots held the ground firm and dug until sweat dampened the old olive fabric across his back despite the cold. The earth was iron at first, then softer below. He lowered her in alone. No prayer came. No grand words. He had known men who deserved more and received less. Still, he straightened the blanket around her before covering her. And that small act felt closer to truth than anything spoken aloud would have. By the time he finished, the light was dropping. He stood over the fresh grave, shovel in hand, breath drifting pale in the air. The puppy was still at Eliza's clinic. Too weak to travel. Too young to survive without heat and strict feeding. Brady had told her he would find a good home for it once it was strong enough. He had said it firmly, as if certainty were a thing a man could manufacture by tone alone. Now, looking down at the mound of turned earth above the frozen creek, he heard his own promise come back to him and knew he had not believed it when he said it. All he had wanted from this place was quiet. Yet standing there in the failing winter light, Brady could not escape the feeling that the silence he had come so far to find had already been broken. Broken not by gunfire, not by memory, but by a pair of tiny wet eyes on the side of a snow road asking him a question he had not answered yet. The days that followed settled into Brady Wren's life with the hard precision of winter work. He rose before dawn when the dark still pressed against the windows and the cold inside the truck had a metallic bite to it. He drove into town with the heater grumbling and the road glazed in pale frost, then drove back out after nightfall with his shoulders heavy and his hands smelling faintly of formula, antiseptic, and dog fur. In between, he worked his new land like a man, trying to convince himself that labor could still the mind if it was honest enough. The property needed everything. The small shed leaned more than Brady liked. One corner of the roof had to be reinforced before the next serious snowfall. Brush needed clearing where the cabin would go. Survey stakes had to be driven. Deadfall had to be cut and stacked. The narrow track from the road to the clearing was half hidden under old ruts and frozen weeds. It was the kind of work he understood. Measure, lift, repair, move on. What he did not understand, at least not naturally, was how much attention it took to keep one tiny life moving forward by inches. Dr. Eliza Boone did not soften the truth for him. Every time Brady walked into her clinic, she had something else for him to learn. How warm the milk should be. How often the puppy had to be fed. How to hold the bottle so it would not aspirate. How to rub its belly and lower body with a warm cloth to help it relieve itself. How to watch for signs of dehydration. How to recognize fading. How to tell the difference between a puppy that was sleeping and a puppy that was slipping. Eliza was not severe by temperament. She was simply a woman who had spent enough years in a small-town veterinary practice to know that tenderness meant nothing unless it was paired with competence. At 38, she carried herself with the calm steadiness of someone long accustomed to being needed before coffee and after midnight. Her dark chestnut hair was almost always pulled back low, though a few strands kept working loose near her temples, and there was usually a trace of fatigue beneath her hazel eyes that made her seem more human, not less. She moved quickly, but never in a way that spread panic. On the third morning, when Brady fumbled the bottle angle and the puppy sputtered, Eliza took it from his hands without a word, corrected the hold, then gave it back. "Again," she said. Brady tried once more. "Better. You ever done anything small before?" she asked, glancing at him sideways. He almost said yes. He almost said he had handled explosives delicate enough to kill a room, radios held together by dust and tape, lives that depended on timing measured in breaths, but none of that fit here. "No," he said at last. "Nothing that small." That earned him the ghost of a small smile. By the end of the first week, the puppy was still fragile, but it was alive in a way that no longer felt accidental. Its shivering had eased. Its breathing no longer sounded like every inhale might be its last. It had a little more strength in its neck. Its eyes, still cloudy with youth, tracked movement with more purpose now. Its coat remained soft and uneven, dark along the back, warmer tan at the sides, with paws too large for the rest of it. It was not pretty in any polished sense. It looked unfinished, stubborn, and somehow deeply serious. Brady never let himself linger over that thought. He told himself he was learning the routine because routine mattered. That was all. He kept a folded sheet of Eliza's instructions in the chest pocket of his old olive shirt until the paper softened and began to crease at the edges. Feeding times, warning signs, emergency numbers. The kind of list a man could follow when he did not yet trust instinct in unfamiliar terrain. At the land he built through the daylight and listened through the dark. The creek moved under the cold with a sound unlike anything else on the property. Not loud, never loud. A narrow running voice beneath crusted banks and thin ice. Some mornings it sounded steady and hidden. Some evenings it changed shape with the temperature and carried farther through the trees. Brady noticed it most when he stopped noticing everything else. He did not sleep properly those first nights. Even after the puppy was stable enough to leave the clinic for a few hours, and then finally for good, Brady slept in short, broken intervals, sitting upright in a metal chair near the wood stove, boots on, blanket over one knee, alarm set for the next feeding. When the puppy whimpered, he woke before the sound fully formed. That unsettled him more than exhaustion did. There had been years in his life when waking fast had meant danger. Here, in a crude shack on a cold piece of land with a half-framed cabin sketched out in stakes and string, waking fast meant reaching for a warmed bottle with hands that could still split logs cleanly, but seemed too large for the task in front of them. The puppy never really cried the way human infants did. It made small, uncertain sounds, as if even complaint took more energy than it could spare. But sometimes, when Brady slid a hand beneath it to lift it from the blanket nest near the stove, the little body relaxed almost immediately against his palm. That quiet trust, if it was trust, sat heavier in him than it should have. Near the end of the first week, Eliza came out to the property herself, partly to see how the puppy was managing, partly because she had the practical instinct to verify what men like Brady meant when they said, "It's fine." She stepped through the door, stamping snow from her boots, took one look at the setup, and nodded once. The bottle was warming in a tin cup by the stove. Extra towels hung, drying on a line Brady had strung above the heat. A cardboard box had been turned into a temporary bed, layered with blankets, one side cut low enough that he could reach in quickly during the night. It was spare, but clean, functional, thought through. "You've done worse jobs, I'm guessing," Eliza said. Brady shrugged. "This one yells less." "He doesn't yell at all." Brady looked toward the blanket box. "That's what worries me." Eliza crouched beside the puppy, checked its gums, belly, and warmth, then looked up at him. "He's getting stronger," she said. "Not strong. Don't confuse the two, but better." Brady gave a short nod. "He may make it," she added. The words should have eased something in him. Instead, they made the room feel more serious, because if the puppy might live, then all this no longer sat in the narrow category of emergency. It was becoming something slower, longer, harder to keep at arm's length. About halfway through the second week, Brady met Mabel Sloan. He had seen smoke from a distant chimney at the end of the dirt road, and once or twice the print of a smaller boot near the track after fresh snow, but he had not gone looking for company. Company had a way of learning names and then asking for stories. That afternoon, he was outside bracing the shed door against the wind when he heard the crunch of deliberate footsteps over packed snow. He turned and saw a woman moving through the birches with the careful steadiness of someone who knew exactly where the ground dipped, even under winter cover. Mabel Sloan was 71, small and narrow-shouldered, wrapped in a brown-gray wool coat that had clearly seen many cold seasons and outlasted most of them. A burgundy scarf was wound neatly at her throat. Her silver-white hair was cut short at the neck, and her face was lined in the way old paper creases, gently but permanently. Nothing in her suggested frailty except size, and even that impression vanished when she stopped in front of Brady and held out a metal thermos. "Soup," she said. "You've been driving in and out at odd hours all week. Figured either you were sick or you were keeping something else alive." Brady took the thermos. "That obvious?" To anyone who still bothers looking. Her pale blue-gray eyes moved once toward the open door of the shed. Not nosy, not prying, Just aware. There's a pup inside, Brady said. So I guessed. She did not ask for the whole story. Brady liked her a little for that, before he meant to. Mabel came in only after he stepped aside. She stood near the stove and looked down into the blanket box where the puppy slept, milk drunk and curled into itself. For a long moment, her expression did not change. Then it softened by half an inch. That one picked a hard man for luck, she said. Brady gave a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. Mabel's gaze drifted to the window, beyond which the creek cut a dark line through the snow. Man who used to own this place, she said. He respected that water more than most people respect preachers. Always said the creek fed you in summer and saved you in thaw if you didn't get proud around it. Brady followed her eyes, but said nothing. Then something small happened. At the sound of Mabel's last words, the puppy, who had been asleep so deeply Brady would have sworn nothing short of hunger could wake it, lifted its head. Just a little. Its cloudy eyes did not open fully, but its body turned toward the window, toward the sound of the creek. Mabel noticed it, too. Well, she said quietly, that's something. The moment passed in another breath. The puppy settled again. Still, the air in the shed had changed. Not with fear, not even with mystery, exactly, just with the strange, unmistakable feeling that the smallest creature in the room had heard something Brady had not. Mabel did not stay long. Before leaving, she told Brady where her house stood if he needed anything, then added, almost as an afterthought, no shame in asking before trouble gets expensive. After she left, Brady poured the soup into a chipped enamel mug and drank it standing by the stove while the puppy slept. The broth was thick with barley and onion. Too hot at first, then not hot enough. He stared down into the steam and thought about what Mabel had said. Not the part about asking for help, but the part about the creek. Saved you in thaw. The phrase lodged somewhere in his mind, even though he had no use for it yet. By the end of the second week, the puppy could hold warmth more steadily and feed with less coaxing. Brady made the drive to town less often, though he still checked in with Eliza and followed her instructions with the kind of exactness he had once reserved for mission briefings. At the land, something else shifted. The puppy began to recognize him, not in some grand way, nothing sentimental, but its body learned the sound of Brady's boots on the floorboards, and its head would lift before he reached the blanket box. Sometimes, if he sat too long without moving after a feeding, it would drag itself in a clumsy line until its side touched his boot. One night the wind came down through the birches and rattled the loose tin on the shed roof. Brady finished the midnight feeding, settled the puppy back into the nest, and sat down in the chair by the stove with his eyes closed just long enough to feel the weight of sleep pressing behind them. A few minutes later, he felt something against his leg. He opened his eyes. The puppy had hauled itself out of the blanket box for the first time on its own and made the slow, determined journey across the rough plank floor. It was barely more than a handful of dog, unsteady on oversized paws, but it had come all the way to him. It leaned its tiny body against his boot, as if that finished the matter. Brady looked down for a long moment. He should have picked it up and returned it to the box immediately. That would have been practical, cleaner, wiser. Instead, he said very quietly, "You need a name." The puppy blinked up at him. Brady's eyes moved toward the black strip of wet ground beyond the window, where the marshy edge of the creek lay hidden under snow and ice. The old owner had called that low land of fun, according to the map notes he had found in the shed drawer. A wet place. A place that held more than it showed. Fun, he said. The puppy gave no sign of approval or surprise. It only folded down against his leg as if the name had found the right body and there was nothing more to discuss. Brady rested one hand lightly on its back. He did not push it away. Outside, the creek moved through the dark in its narrow winter voice, and inside the shed, with a half-finished cabin waiting beyond the door and the long season still ahead of him, Brady began to understand that he was no longer carrying this small life out of obligation alone. Something quieter had begun, something that did not ask permission. By the time the first winter began to loosen its grip, Brady Wren had learned that survival on that piece of land came down to rhythm. Not peace, not comfort, rhythm. He worked by daylight and watched by habit. He split wood until the stack beside the shed rose to shoulder height twice. He straightened the roof line with new braces, patched weak boards, and marked the square where the cabin would stand once the ground gave him a fair chance to dig. In the mornings, The snow still lay hard and blue in the shadows. By afternoon, it softened along the edges of the creek and darkened where the earth underneath had started to breathe again. Finn changed with the season. He grew slowly at first, as if life had been cautious about giving too much back all at once. Then, little by little, the puppy lengthened. His legs came first, awkward and long, too much bone for the rest of him. His ears had not yet decided what they wanted to be. One would stand halfway, while the other folded over at the tip. His coat thickened into clearer colors, dark along the back, warmer along the neck and legs. And his eyes, once cloudy with newborn uncertainty, sharpened into a steady dark intelligence that rarely missed much. He was not a playful fool of a pup. He studied things, listened to them, measured before moving. Brady understood that better than he cared to admit. He began training Fun in small ways because small ways suited them both. A quiet whistle to call him back, a hand signal to wait, a rolled rag to hold and release on command, a short length of rope for light pulling, not for work yet, only for feel and discipline. Brady never treated the dog like a toy, and Finn never behaved like one. Their time together had the same quiet seriousness as the rest of the land. Not harsh, not sentimental, just honest. There were evenings after the stove had burned low, and the sky outside turned silver over the trees, when Finn would lie at Brady's boots and watch the man shave a sliver of wood smooth with his knife, or mend a hinge, or oil the leather of an old glove. In those moments, the bond between them did not look like affection in the usual sense. It looked more like recognition. Two creatures learning each other by silence, by routine, by the absence of betrayal. When the thaw first began in earnest, Brady noticed Finn paying unusual attention to the creek. At first, it seemed like ordinary animal curiosity. The dog would trot ahead, pause at a patch of soft ground, then circle back. Or he would stop beside a shallow ditch half hidden under old reeds and stare into it for a long time, as though waiting for something Brady could not hear. Sometimes he scratched at the mud where the banks looked ordinary enough to human eyes. Other times he stood at a bend where the water seemed to divide around a low bar of stones before joining again farther down. Brady watched all this and told himself it was simply what dogs did. Still, he began to notice patterns. Finn returned to the same places. He was especially drawn to one stretch below the birches where the creek, narrow and dark under the spring light, brushed against a low embankment that seemed too smooth to be entirely natural. Another time, the dog froze near a half-filled runnel that cut away from the creek and disappeared into a shallow depression, now mostly clogged with last year's leaves and silt. Finn pawed at it, then looked back at Brady with unusual insistence. "You smell a rabbit," Brady said. Finn did not move. That in itself meant something. A week later, Brady brought Mabel Sloan down to the water. The old woman came wrapped in her brown-gray coat, boots sinking only slightly into the softening ground. Her silver hair tucked under a knit cap this time against the damp wind. She was not one for wasted motion. She stood where Brady pointed, listened to him say very little, then bent slowly to study the line of the bank and the shallow side cut, where Fun had been scratching. Fun stood near her, alert but still, as if he understood this was not a game. Mabel looked at the ditch, then at the wider bend beyond it, and the thoughtful calm in her face narrowed into something more focused. "Do you have a table inside yet?" she asked. "2 sawhorses and a door slab. That'll do." She came back an hour later with a flat cardboard portfolio tied in string. Inside were old county survey copies, brittle and yellowed along the folds, and hand-marked plats from years before Brady had ever heard the name of the place. She spread them across the makeshift table in the cabin, while Finn nosed at the corner and then settled under Brady's chair. The maps showed the land not as people were used to seeing it now, but as it had once moved. The creek was not one neat line. It split in places. It spilled into side channels. It widened over marshy ground before tightening again. There were marks for overflow runs and drainage cuts, and one faded pencil note that read, "Seasonal relief branch. Opens under heavy thaw." Mabel tapped the paper with a bent finger. "Folks think a stream ought to behave like a fence line," she said. "Straight, contained, useful. But this one was never built to behave. It spreads when it needs to." Brady leaned closer, the smell of old paper and cold air mixing with the wood smoke behind him. "So those aren't mistakes? They're the reason the lower ground didn't drown every warm spring." She glanced up at him. The man who owned this place before you knew that. Kept those relief cuts open by hand when he had to. Didn't trust officials much, but he trusted water less if it was forced. Brady looked toward the window where the creek moved in strips of steel gray between the banks. And if someone closed them? Mabel gave him a long look. Then the water would remember what was taken from it, just not in a gentle way. That line stayed with him. Not because it sounded wise, though it did. Because it sounded true. As the weather turned, signs of outside interest began to appear downstream. Fresh survey stakes, bright flag tops catching in the wind. Tire tracks deeper than farm traffic. Men walking boundary lines with clipboards and metal markers. Brady heard about the project before anyone officially came to speak to him. A winter access road and seasonal materials yard. The kind of thing county officials like to describe as practical investment. A few dozen jobs, cheaper cold weather hauling, easier supply storage. Useful enough that most people in the area welcomed it before anyone had broken real ground. Brady understood that part. In towns like these, usefulness could pass for mercy. The first time Dale Rourke came out, he arrived in a county truck that was cleaner than Kurt Danner's, but not by much. Dale was 47, broad through the shoulders, thickening a little at the waist, the way hard-working men often do when middle age catches up with long winters and roadside meals. His face was lined from wind and responsibility more than comfort. He had brown hair cut short with enough gray at the temples to make it clear he had earned the habit of being listened to. Nothing about him suggested a bully. He looked like a man who had spent his adult life solving hard problems with equipment, budgets, and time he never fully had. That made him more complicated than Kurt, and therefore more dangerous in his own way. He stood outside the cabin with his gloves tucked into one hand, and his tone set carefully between polite and firm. "Mr. Wren, I wanted to come myself," he said. "Your property line isn't in dispute. We won't be taking ground from you. There'll be some work farther down where the creek narrows. Some channel correction, stabilization." Correction? Dale nodded once as if that word ought to reassure. Nothing dramatic. "We're cleaning up a section that's always been messy, making the flow more predictable, better for transport, better for runoff management." Brady said nothing right away. Finn stood near his leg, ears tipped forward, not growling, just watching. Dale followed the dog with his eyes for half a second. Fine-looking shepherd. Brady didn't answer that, either. At last, he said, "Predictable for who?" Something flickered in Dale's expression, not irritation yet, but the awareness that he was dealing with a man who would not be smoothed over by public phrasing. For the county, for the road crews, for people who need the route open when weather turns. He glanced toward the lower stretch of land. This project matters to more than one property owner. Brady knew that was true. He also knew when truth was being used to walk something questionable past a man before he had time to examine it. Dale's gaze moved once more toward the creek. "We're not the enemy here." "I didn't say you were." "No," Dale said, "but you looked like you were thinking it." The two men stood a moment in the raw spring air, both too controlled to let the conversation turn theatrical. When Dale left, Brady did not feel calmer. He felt the opposite. The explanation had come too cleanly, too quickly, as if the language had been prepared for every practical objection, but none of the older, messier truths the land itself might hold. Around that same time, Kurt Danner showed up again at a downstream survey site. Brady saw him first by the posture, a man standing too loose around work, his hands making gestures sharper than they needed to be. Kurt wore the same kind of stained work jacket, the same sour look of someone who blamed the world for forcing him to reveal what he was. He glanced at Brady once across the open ground, and then away, but there was no shame in the look, only resentment. That mattered. It told Brady what he had suspected already. The violence by the roadside had not been a single bad hour. Men like Kurt did not become that in one morning. They carried it in them. It moved from whatever was weakest and nearest. An animal, a woman, a fence post, a hired hand, and called itself bad luck or hard living. Still, Brady understood something else just as clearly. It would be a mistake to imagine the whole project wore Kurt's face. Dale Rourke was not Kurt. He did not enjoy cruelty. He simply believed that enough paper, concrete, and schedule could make a rough piece of country obey. That kind of belief had wrecked plenty, too. By late afternoon, the sky had gone high and pale. The kind of northern spring sky that made distances look farther than they were. Brady walked back up along the creek with Finn ranging ahead and then returning, ahead and back again, never out of touch for long. The dog stopped suddenly near a place Brady had passed 3 times without much thought. A half-buried branch of the old side channel Mabel had shown him on the map. Brush had been pushed over it. Mud packed in. Not finished off, but not untouched, either. Finn stepped into the shallow hollow and stood there, rigid. His ears were half raised now, one still softer than the other. His young body all long lines and gathering strength. He lowered his nose, then lifted it again. He did not dig this time. He only stared at the blocked run as if listening through it. Brady came to a stop beside him. The breeze carried the smell of wet earth, last year's leaves, and fresh-cut timber from farther down. Somewhere a truck door slammed. Somewhere else a crow complained from a birch top. Finn did not look away. For the first time, Brady felt something colder than ordinary worry pass through him. Not panic, not even fear, exactly, but the quiet shock of realizing he might be looking at the beginning of damage before it had a name. He stood there a long while beside the young dog, staring at the half-buried branch of water that people farther downstream might already have dismissed as useless ground. And for the first time, Brady wondered whether Finn was sensing something in that place before any human hand had admitted what it meant to destroy it. Spring did not arrive on Brady Wren's land with birdsong and sentiment. It arrived in mud. The snow withdrew in stubborn patches beneath the pines, leaving behind black earth, last year's leaves, and a wetness that got into the cuffs of his old work boots before breakfast. The creek widened by inches and changed color from steel gray to cold brown, then to something clearer once the runoff settled. Brady worked through it all the way he had worked through most things in his life, without ceremony, without audience, and without pretending it was noble. He finished the cabin before summer properly took hold. It was a small place, plain and square-shouldered, built out of necessity more than vision. One main room, a narrow sleeping space, a stove, shelves he made himself, and a window that looked toward the creek whether he meant it to or not. He felled dead standing timber, dragged it, cut it, stacked it. He laid flooring with hands that had once assembled equipment under worse conditions and found, to his mild surprise, that would answer pressure more honestly than men often did. Finn grew through those months the way a good dog does when given food, order, and room to become what he was meant to be. The awkward little body of Spring lengthened into something leaner, stronger, more assured. By midsummer, his ears had settled into place, upright and alert, and his chest began to deepen. The dark line along his back grew richer. The tan at his shoulders and legs warmed in the sun. His movements lost their puppy uncertainty and took on a kind of economy Brady respected. Finn did not waste energy. He watched first, chose second, acted cleanly. That suited the life Brady was building. The training stayed simple at first because Brady had no interest in turning the dog into a performance. He taught recall with whistle and hand signal. Stay, heel, quiet, hold, release. Later came the heavier rag, folded thick and tied to a short line. Finn learned to take it hard, plan himself, and keep his grip even when Brady shifted tension and angle. Then came the short rope pull, not as a trick, but as a way to teach the dog how to lean into strain without panic, how to feel resistance and stay with it. What began as exercise became language. There were evenings when Brady would be squatting in the grass behind the cabin, one hand on the line, the other braced on his knee, and Finn would brace opposite him, jaws set, body low, not wild or noisy, just committed. Brady would feel the strength running through the dog's neck and shoulders and give the smallest nod. That's it, he would say. Hold. Now pull. Finn would lean back, paws digging into the soil, eyes fixed on Brady's face for the next cue. No one watching would have mistaken it for a man amusing himself with a pet. There was trust in it, but there was also discipline, mutual attention, and something quieter than affection, something like respect. By August, Brady had fallen into a rhythm with 2 women he had never planned to know. Dr. Eliza Boone came out every few weeks under one pretext or another. Sometimes it was to look at Finn's gait, or to check his weight, or to bring supplements. Though Brady suspected, she often came simply to make sure neither the man nor the dog had slid too far back into silence. She moved through the cabin as she had moved through the clinic from the first day Brady met her, without fuss, with quick practiced eyes, noticing everything. When she spoke, it was never to fill air. That alone made Brady easier around her than he liked admitting. Mabel Sloan came less often, but stayed longer. She brought old county copies, scraps of remembered history, and stories that never sounded like stories when she told them. To Mabel, the creek was not scenery. It was a living habit the land had formed long before roads and permits. She could stand with Brady on the bank, looking at water most people would glance at once and forget, and tell him where it had run wide 40 years earlier, where one branch used to spread and thaw, where an overflow cut had saved the lower lots in a spring no one under 60 still remembered. The three of them never called what was forming around Brady a friendship, much less a community. But some bonds arrive without naming themselves. Summer passed. Fall came lean and bright. The birches yellowed first, thin and luminous in the slant light. Fun ran stronger now, covering ground with that easy ground-eating stride shepherds have when their bones have finally caught up to their will. Brady sometimes took him through the property lines and farther along the creek, practicing off-lead control and quiet returns. Finn would range ahead, disappear behind brush, then reappear soundlessly at Brady's shoulder as if he had been there all along. On colder evenings, he lay with his head across Brady's boots while the man worked at the table. And when Brady spoke aloud to him, which he did more than to any human being, his voice changed without him thinking about it. It lost the guarded edge he wore around everyone else. He no longer needed to pretend anything in that cabin. That truth met him head on the day Eliza mentioned the family. It was late autumn then, the first skim of ice just beginning to form in the shaded puddles. Fawn, now nearly full-grown though still young enough to be restless under the skin, was asleep near the stove with one paw thrown across Brady's left boot. Eliza had come out after checking a horse farther up the county road and stayed for coffee that went lukewarm before either of them remembered to drink it. "There's a couple outside Hayward," she said, looking into her mug rather than at him. "Retired. Good land. Fenced. They asked me if I knew of a shepherd that might fit." Brady's first answer came too fast. "That's so." Eliza nodded. "They've handled working dogs before. Quiet household. No children." Brady kept his face still. That had once been easy for him. Less so now. He'd do fine there, Eliza said, not pressing, simply laying the thought on the table between them. Brady looked down at Fun. The dog was asleep hard, head resting over Brady's worn boot, as if the leather belonged to him as much as the man did. One ear twitched at the sound of Eliza's voice, but he did not wake. For the space of a breath, Brady nearly said yes. Not because he wanted to lose the dog, but because the old instinct was still in him, the one that mistrusted needing anything enough to keep it. Better to decide early. Better to call attachment practical and temporary. Better to move before something rooted too deeply. Then Finn stirred, opened one dark eye, and looked up at Brady without lifting his head. It was not a dramatic moment. No whine. No appeal. Just a calm, direct look from a creature who had long since stopped asking permission to belong where he belonged. Brady felt the answer catch in his throat. "I'll think on it," he said. Eliza's gaze rested on him for a second longer than necessary. She was wise enough not to smile. Winter returned with less warning than memory. One week the ground was only hard in the mornings. The next, white light had taken over the woods again, and ice had begun to lace the creek's edges in thin, brittle lines. The pines went dark against the snow. Sound traveled farther. Smoke rose straight up from the cabin chimney in the still cold before dawn. Downstream, the county project moved into its final shape. They brought in more fill, set culverts, leveled the old side runs. What had been rough work and survey stakes became earth pushed into place with confidence. The line of the future winter access road looked cleaner now, straighter, more efficient to men who valued those things. Brady stood above it one morning and saw not neatness, but interruption. Places where the bank had been shouldered too high. Places where water would have less room to spread if thaw came fast. Places where something old had been told to behave. He started keeping records with the seriousness of a man who could feel time narrowing. He photographed the banks after each change, marked soft ground and new pooling with wooden stakes of his own, noted where current undercut the fill at odd angles, measured the width of the side channels that remained, wrote down dates, temperatures, small details another man might call excessive. But Brady learned long ago that if you wanted to be heard by people who trusted systems more than instincts, you had better bring evidence with you. Mabel came one afternoon carrying a narrow, weather-stained notebook she had found among papers from the former owner of Brady's land. The cover was nearly worn smooth. Inside were brief entries in a hand too hurried for elegance and too practical for show. Brady stood at the table reading while Finn lay at his feet, chin on paws. Some notes were about timber, some about frost lines, some about old repairs to the footbridge that no longer existed. Then Brady found the sentence that stayed with him after everything else blurred around it. Never close the side mouth while the ice still holds and the sun starts climbing. The wording was crude. The meaning was not. Mabel washed his face while he read it. He wasn't a poet, she said, but he knew what he was afraid of. Brady read the line again. Outside, the creek moved under a skin of ice thin enough to break and thick enough to hide what it was doing. A few days later, Brady took what he had gathered to Ben Harlan. Ben was head of the county road crew, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with windburned skin. A flattened nose from some old collision life had not bothered to explain, and the kind of thick forearms that came from years of lifting chains, shoveling slush, and wrenching frozen equipment back into usefulness. He wore skepticism like another layer of flannel, not mean, just permanent. Their meeting happened in the road shed with engines cooling in the bays and the smell of diesel hanging in the air. Ben listened because Brady had asked plainly and brought something more than nerves. He flipped through the photographs, studied the notes, then set them down on the scarred workbench between them. "You know what you're asking?" Ben said. "I'm asking you to look closer. I've got crews working off approvals already signed. I know. Machines are in, materials in. Winter doesn't wait around here while men revisit every decision." Brady met his eyes. "Water doesn't either." That landed. Not enough to win. Enough to slow the room. Ben rubbed a thumb along the edge of one photograph and looked at the mark Brady had made beside a partially blocked side cut. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he said at last. "I'm saying right now you're a man with a notebook standing against a project that's already halfway to done." Brady gave a short nod. He had expected nothing softer. Ben slid the papers back toward him. "But I'll keep my eyes open." It was not support. It was not dismissal, either. For that stage of the story, it was enough. By late January, the forecast began to change. At first it came through in the ordinary way, small talk in the feed store, a mention on local radio, a line buried in the county weather update. Then the predictions sharpened. A warm spell at the wrong time, several days above freezing. Rain possible on top of crusted snow. To most people, that sounded like relief. Easier roads. Softer ground. A brief break from the heavy cold. Brady heard it differently. So did Mabel. He could tell by the way she went quiet when she folded the forecast paper in half on his table. Eliza heard it, too, though she said less about the creek than about what sudden thaw did to roads, livestock, roofs, and old men who insisted on climbing ladders anyway. And Ben Harlan, when Brady ran into him near the fuel stop 2 mornings later, did not joke the way other men did about finally getting a little mercy from the season. Instead, he said, "I've started watching the lower culvert mouths." That was all. It was enough. The air held a new kind of pressure after that. Not storm pressure. Something stranger. The feeling of a clock beginning to move where no one else could yet hear it ticking. The warmth came wrong. Not strong enough to be called spring. Not honest enough to be welcomed. It arrived in thin bands of afternoon sun that made the snow shine harder while undoing it from underneath. The woods around Brady Wren's cabin still looked clean and white from a distance. The pines stood dark and steady. The creek ran between pale banks beneath the brittle brightness of late winter. But once he stepped off the packed path and onto the ground itself, he felt the change at once. The crust gave a little where it should have held. The soil beneath the snow had gone soft in places. The edges of the ice no longer gripped the water with the same clean line. Finn felt it before Brady let himself name it. The young German shepherd had grown into a lean, deep-chested dog, all strength and watchfulness now. His black and tan coat carried the cold light sharply, dark along the back, warm at the legs and chest. Ears fixed high whenever he listened to the land. He no longer moved like a pup. He moved like something tuned. That week he became restless in a way Brady had not seen before. Not nervous, not wild, focused. Finn kept drawing him back toward the same weak spots near the creek. He would trot ahead, stop, then circle back and put himself across Brady's path until the man followed. At one low stretch where the bank looked ordinary enough under a fresh cover of white, Finn planted himself sideways, and would not let Brady step forward until Brady tested the ground with a long branch. The surface broke faster than it should have, revealing a hollowed softness underneath. At another place, the dog ran to the old relief branch that had been half filled and nearly flattened by the county crew. He stood there staring at the shallow depression as if waiting for someone else to admit what he already knew. Brady crouched and studied the ground. The snow was whiter than truth, but beneath it the water had begun to push in ways he recognized from Mabel's maps and the old notebook. It was not just flow anymore. It was pressure. He spent the next 2 days gathering everything he had. Photographs of the altered banks, measurements scratched into a legal pad, the old county copies Mabel had loaned him, a page from the dead landowner's notebook copied carefully by hand. He walked the creek with a camera, a measuring tape, and Fun at his side, stopping wherever the dog stopped. Sometimes Fun lowered his head and listened to the bank, not sniffing, not pawing, only listening. Brady had stopped finding that strange. He found it useful. The town meeting was held in the old Grange Hall, the sort of room built for potlucks, disputes, and folded metal chairs that never quite sat level on a wooden floor. Brady had not wanted to go. He went because not going would have been easier, and he no longer trusted easy where the creek was concerned. By the time he stepped inside, the room was nearly full. Men in work jackets and seed caps, women with tired faces and thick winter coats folded over their arms, older folks who had lived through enough bad seasons to distrust anyone promising certainty, and younger ones who had never had the luxury of refusing a paycheck. The air smelled faintly of coffee, wet boots, and the old heat of a building that had seen too many winters to ever warm evenly. Dale Rourke stood near the front, one hand resting on the back of a chair, speaking with the county clerk. He looked as Brady remembered him, controlled, wind-cut, solid in the way men become when their authority has been earned by years of showing up before dawn. He was not flashy. He did not need to be. His kind of confidence came from clipboards, budgets, machine hours, signed approvals, and enough experience to believe all difficult things could eventually be arranged into a manageable shape. Brady took a chair along the sidewall, papers in hand. Fun remained outside in the truck. That bothered him more than it should have. The meeting began with ordinary business, road conditions, fuel issues, plowing routes, supply delays. Then the winter access project came up. Dale moved to the front and explained the progress in measured terms. Material had arrived. Culverts were in. Final grading remained. If the weather held, the county would secure a road and yard that could reduce transport costs and provide seasonal work to men who badly needed it. No one in the room was blind to that last part. Brady could feel it before anyone spoke. The strain people carried, the way hope, when it finally appeared in practical clothes, became almost sacred. When the chair opened the floor, Brady stood. The room shifted at once. Not because anyone liked him, because they already knew why he had risen. He did not waste time trying to charm them. The creek below the project isn't stable the way the design assumes, he said. The side relief branch has been narrowed too far, and the bank fill is already undercutting in thaw. A few faces hardened immediately. Others simply went still. He laid the photographs on the front table, then the copies of the old maps. This water used to spread pressure. That's how the lower lots stayed safe when the thaw came fast. Dale stepped forward before the silence could settle. With respect, he said, and his tone was respectful enough to sound almost sincere. Mr. Wren is working from informal observations, old surveys, and partial historical notes. Our current design has engineering review. Brady turned to him. Your current design assumes the creek behaves like it did after those side channels were already cut down. Dale's jaw shifted once. No, it assumes the system can be improved, which it can. Brady tapped one of the photos. That bank is failing under the fill already. That is frost movement. It is not. This time Dale's voice lost a degree of polish. You are a former serviceman with a piece of land upstream. That does not make you a hydrologist. Brady did not flinch. No, it makes me a man who walks the ground every day. That drew a murmur. Not support. Friction. A woman in the second row rose before Dale could answer. She was maybe in her late 50s with a lined face and the look of someone who had stretched too little money across too many seasons. My boy got 3 weeks' work off that project, she said. You asking us to shut that down because your dog doesn't like the creek? The question came sharp, but grief lived under it. So did fear. Brady looked at her and, because he respected fear that told the truth about itself, answered honestly. I'm asking you to look at what happens if the thaw comes hard and the water has nowhere left to go. A man near the back spoke up then, older, broader, the hands of a mechanic or farmer. And if we stop this now, he said, what then? Who pays for next winter? Who pays if hauling costs stay high and the yard never opens? You. There it was. The real room finally. Not ignorance, not cruelty. Need. That made the thing harder and in a bitter way cleaner. Dale turned slightly, not to Brady now, but to the crowd. I'm not dismissing concern, he said. I'm saying the county used reviewed plans. We have crews in place, material committed, timing already tight. If we halt every time someone brings us a set of worries and an old hand-drawn note, nothing gets built in this county. That landed the way practical language always does when practical lives are hanging from it. Brady knew in that moment that he would not be seen as a protector in this room. Not tonight. He was the man threatening wages, fuel savings, a chance at stability. The man bringing doubt when everyone needed reassurance. Near the side window where late light had begun to thin across the frosted glass, Brady saw Eliza standing in the back. She must have come in quietly. She said nothing, but when his eyes found hers, she gave the smallest shake of her head, not to tell him he was wrong, but to warn him that the room had already chosen what it wanted to hear. That look did something inside him. It did not weaken him. It made the cost plain. He gathered his papers slowly. I'm not asking you to trust me because of who I used to be, he said, looking out across the room. I'm asking you to look at what the water is doing now, not what we wish it would do. No one answered. Not because they were persuaded, because everyone had already moved to the harder, sadder question. What if he was right, and they still could not afford to listen? Brady left without waiting for thanks or insults. He got both anyway once he stepped outside. Damn outsider. Easy to preach when it's not your mortgage. Dogman thinks he knows our land. He heard all of it and turned to none of it. Fun was waiting in the truck, upright in the passenger seat, ears high, eyes fixed on the hall door before Brady even reached the cab. When Brady climbed in, the dog leaned once against his shoulder. Not comfort exactly, more a brief transfer of weight, and then settled back. The drive home passed through the white blaze of late sun. The road shone. The drifts glowed. Fields looked almost wholly under that light, which only made the bitterness of the meeting sit more sharply in him. He had been hated before. In war, that kind of thing meant little. Here it was different. These were not enemies. They were people clutching at a future thin enough to tear if someone pulled wrong. That was what made it lonely. Ben Harlan found him the next morning at the fuel stop just outside town. Ben stood with one elbow on the bed rail of his county truck, cap pulled low, face red from cold and lack of sleep. He looked like a man who had spent the night half arguing with himself. I read through what you left, he said. Brady waited. Ben looked past him toward the road, toward nothing in particular. If you're wrong, he said, you've stirred a room that was already near the boil. And if I'm right, Ben's mouth flattened. If you're right, when it goes, nobody's going to have time to argue about who should have listened. He let that sit between them. Then he added, quieter, I'm watching the lower section. It was not allegiance. It was more valuable than that. It was an honest man admitting the possibility of trouble before he was ready to act on it. Brady nodded once. That's enough for now. That evening he took Finn back along the creek in the slanting light of late winter. The dog moved ahead and back with that now familiar intensity, pausing where the bank sounded wrong underfoot, stopping again at the old relief branch, then circling back to Brady without impatience, as if he knew the man needed to see each thing for himself. The snow shone gold where the sun hit it. Underneath, water ran dark and fuller than it should have for that date. Brady stood for a long moment looking down the channel, then at the line of fill farther below where the crew meant to finish the final closure. He did not feel dramatic. He felt tired, then determined. Sometimes those were close cousins. Back in the cabin after dark, he took out the short training rope and the heavy folded rag. Fun rose immediately from beside the stove and came to him with full attention. Brady knotted the rope tighter than before. Hold, he said. Fun took the rag cleanly. Don't give it up. The dog set his feet. Brady pulled to one side. Fun countered, not by panicking backward, but by adjusting angle and weight exactly as Brady had taught him through summer and fall. That's right, Brady said. Stay with it. Pull off line. Again and again. It was only training. Yet something about the repetition steadied Brady's breathing. He was not rehearsing a rescue. He was doing what he had always done when the world narrowed, working the basics until they became part of the bones. By the time he put the rope away, the stove had burned low and the windows reflected only darkness. Morning came bright and cold. Brady opened the cabin door and knew before he checked the watch that he had slept too long by 10 minutes, and not at all by what mattered. Downstream, machines would already be warming. The crew had planned to place the final blocking fill at the old relief branch that day. Finn stood a few yards from the door, already facing the creek. He was not pacing, not barking, just standing there in the white light with all his attention fixed on the line of water and earth below. Brady looked at the dog, then toward the narrowed branch, and understood with a clarity that left no room for comfort that whatever chance remained to stop a mistake from becoming something worse was shrinking by the hour. The morning came so clear it looked harmless. Sunlight lay clean across the snow, bright enough to make a man narrow his eyes. The birch trunks shone pale against the dark pines. Frost clung to the fence wire near the road in delicate white threads. And the creek, at first glance, seemed no more dangerous than a strip of dark ribbon moving under glass. That was what made it frightening. Brady Wren was outside before the stove in the cabin had fully warmed the room behind him. He had slept in broken pieces, not from fear, exactly, but from the pressure of knowing that the work downstream would not wait for certainty. Finn had been restless since before dawn, rising twice from his place by the door, pacing once across the floor, then standing with his head lifted toward the creek as if listening to something Brady could not hear yet. By the time Brady stepped into the white morning, Finn was already near the bank. The dog did not bark. He did not run in circles. He stood rigid, black and tan coat cut sharp by the light. Every line of his body pulled toward the same place below the bend where the old relief branch had nearly been shut off. His ears were high. His tail was still. He looked less like an animal waiting for instruction and more like one holding a post. Brady moved down carefully through the crusted snow. At the lower stretch, the final banking was nearly done. Fresh fill lay against the old edge in a hard, unnatural line. Beyond it, the water backing up from above had gone strangely calm. Not smooth in the gentle way of a quiet stream. Smooth in the way something dangerous sometimes turns smooth just before it breaks shape. Brady crouched and watched. He had learned enough by then not to trust appearances. The creek was fuller than it had any right to be for that hour. Water pressed under the thin ice at the margins without speaking much. The current below the surface seemed to hesitate, then gather, then hesitate again. It was the silence inside it that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Finn descended 2 steps closer, then stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "Stay where you are," Brady said. Finn did not obey. He shifted sideways and placed himself along the line Brady would have taken if he had come straight down the bank. The move was deliberate enough to register, but Brady was already focused on the ground ahead. He tested one patch with the butt of a stick, then another. The upper crust held. He edged farther out along the frozen margin to get a better look at where the backed-up water was pressing against the fill. The bank gave way all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, just a sudden, sick slip. The snow dropped under him because the earth beneath it had already turned to saturated ruin. One boot slid through, then the other. Brady had time for one sharp breath, one instinctive reach, and then the whole edge tore away. The cold hit him like impact. The water was not merely freezing. It was violent in its cold, the kind that stole thought before it stole strength. It slammed him sideways and drove the air from his chest. His shoulder clipped ice. Then current took him under the broken edge and rolled him hard into a submerged rock. Pain burst up his right leg so fast and so bright that it seemed to light the inside of his skull. He knew the break before he surfaced. The knowledge came not from panic, but from experience. The angle was wrong. The leg failed when he tried to plant it. Something hot and jagged shot from ankle to hip, and then the cold came roaring back around it. Brady twisted, fighting for the bank, but the current seized the bad leg and spun him broadside. Ice fragments cracked against his chest and neck. The water was not wide, but width had nothing to do with it. It had weight, force, and a will of its own. He caught a glimpse of the sky, white light, birch limbs. Then another hit from below sent him under to the shoulders again. This was the point, clearer than fear, where Brady understood that willpower had limits. He had lived through enough bad moments to know the lie men told themselves afterward, that they had simply refused to quit. But there were times when refusal meant nothing if the body could no longer answer. His right leg was useless. One arm scraped at ice-slick earth and found none. The creek kept turning him, dragging him, reducing him to weight and motion. Then Finn hit the water. The splash came from upstream and to Brady's left. Not a wild leap, a committed one. Finn drove into the current with his head low and his body angled, fighting not to meet the creek head-on, but to cut across it. Brady saw one flash of dark ears and wet fur. Then the dog was at him, jaws searching, missing once on a sleeve, then finding the thick collar seam of Brady's work jacket. The bite locked. Finn did not try to drag him upward like some impossible story. He did what Brady had trained into him without ever imagining this use. He held. He set his body against the pull. He took the strain through neck, shoulders, spine. Brady felt the line of force change. Not enough to save him outright, but enough to turn him half a body width closer to the edge instead of farther into the middle. Hold, Brady gasped, though he was not sure whether he spoke to the dog or to himself. Finn held. The dog's eyes were wide now, not with panic, but with furious concentration. His paws churned in the water. Once the current nearly rolled him under, but he corrected, biting deeper through the soaked collar fabric, pulling Brady not out of the creek, but off the worst line of it. Brady's left hand struck something solid at last. Not earth, a root. A willow root had worked its way out from the bank and bent low over the cut. Brady caught it with numb fingers, lost it, caught it again, then wrapped his wrist around it, and pulled with everything the broken leg no longer could give him. The root held. Finn kept his grip just long enough for Brady to drag his chest onto the slush-heavy margin. When he rolled clear of the main current, the pain in his right leg nearly blackened the world. He lay half on the bank, half in the snow, coughing creek water, one hand still clamped on the willow root as though the earth itself might pull away again. Finn let go only when Brady's weight stayed put. The dog backed 2 steps, shook once from nose to tail, and then began barking with a force Brady had heard only once or twice before. Not warning, not challenge. Alarm. Sharp. Repeated. Urgent enough to cut through the machinery noise carrying from downstream. Brady tried to rise and failed. The leg folded wrong beneath him, and white pain slammed through him again. He bit back the sound that rose in his throat, got one elbow under himself, and forced his eyes to the fill line. The water had changed while he was in it. What had looked merely backed up minutes earlier now bore that dense, silent pressure of something deciding where to break. The partial closure had turned the old side branch into a sealed mouth. The flow from above was stacking on itself. If the bank failed at the wrong point now, the water would not spread gently. It would drive. Finn was still barking when Ben Harlan came running through the brush with 2 men from the road crew close behind him. Ben took one look at Brady sprawled in the snow, soaked through, face gray with pain, and swore once under his breath. He was a practical man, but practicality falls away fast when another man is suddenly half dead in front of you. What happened? Bank gave, Brady said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Finn. He hated that. Legs broken. Ben glanced at the water, then back at him. We need to get you up to the truck. No. Brady forced the word harder. Not yet. He pointed with a shaking hand toward the fill. There. That shoulder. Cut it open now. Ben followed the line of his finger. One of the crewmen, a young man with a beard rimed pale from the cold, shifted uneasily. The plan says. To hell with the plan, Brady snapped, the old command edge coming out of him before he could soften it. He dragged a breath, then spoke lower, clearer. You open the old branch there, and the water takes the side run. You wait 10 minutes. It'll punch past the top line and go straight for the lower road and the first houses below it. Ben hesitated. Not because he didn't believe Brady, because the decision, once made, could not be made small again. Brady saw the calculation in his face and knew there was only one thing left to give him. Look at the cut, he said. It's already under. You know it. Ben looked. He saw it then. The fine sloughing under the fresh fill, the darker bulge where trapped water had begun to eat at the earth from below. The same thing Brady had seen too late from the bank. Ben straightened and shouted toward the machine farther down. Get the excavator up here now. Everything after that moved with the ugly speed of real emergencies. Brady did not become the hero who leapt back to his feet. He stayed where he was, propped against the bank, one hand clamped on his ruined leg just above the brake to keep his thinking clear. He pointed, corrected angles, told Ben where the old branch had once cut wider, what Mabel's maps had shown, where not to punch too deep or the whole upper shoulder would shear off with it. Ben took the excavator himself. The bucket bit into the fill once, twice. Mud and packed snow collapsed away. Water struck the opening with a low, starving sound and began to force through. Not enough. Ben widened it. One of the crewmen jumped down with a shovel and nearly lost it from his hands when the first heavy rush hit. Fun ran the bank like a sentry gone wild, barking where the earth softened, doubling back to Brady, then racing again toward the breach. Twice Brady used the dog's reaction to redirect a crewman away from a spot that was about to give way under his boots. Then the creek made its choice. The plug line failed inward instead of outward. Water tore through the reopened side branch in a brown, surging sheet, carrying broken ice, sticks, and chunks of loosened bank with it. What should have spread days earlier now roared where it had once been meant to roar, through the old relief cut and away from the lower drop that would have driven it straight toward the homes below. The sound changed. That was the first thing Brady noticed after the worst danger passed. The sound changed from trapped pressure to movement, from threat to release. Dale Rourke arrived in the middle of it, boots splashing through the slush, his face drained of color beneath the cold red skin. He stopped short when he saw the opened cut, the water thundering through the old branch, Brady white-faced in the snow, and Ben still in the machine cab, finishing the widening pass. "What the hell did you do?" Dale shouted. Ben looked down at him through the open cab door. What should have been done before? Kurt Danner came behind Dale, and then made the mistake of speaking too fast. "I told them to cap that side run yesterday, just to keep the line clean till." He stopped. Too late. Ben turned his head sharply. Dale's eyes went to Kurt, then to the extra dumped earth near the upper edge, then back to the water chewing through the spot Brady had warned about. In that instant, the last argument in the room died. Not because Brady won it, because the creek had answered for him. Brady's vision had started narrowing by then. The cold was settling deeper than his soaked clothes. Pain came in waves now, distant and enormous. Fun returned at last and pressed against his left side, shivering so hard his teeth clicked once against each other. Brady put one numb hand into the wet fur at the dog's neck. "Good," he said, barely louder than breath. "Good dog." It was not praise the way people praise pets. It was the kind of acknowledgement one working soul gives another after the line has held. Voices blurred around him. Men moving, someone kneeling. Ben saying, "Stay with me." Dale swearing at Kurt in a tone stripped of all county politeness. Water still rushing, but now in the right direction. Before Brady lost consciousness, he heard that new sound fully. Not disaster. Not collapse. Not the tearing noise of something being taken. It was the sound of water turning where it had needed to turn all along. And in the thinning edge of his thoughts, it struck him as the first answer he had ever heard in his life that did not come from a man. When Brady Wren came back to himself, the first thing he understood was that he was indoors. Not because of the ceiling. Not because of the smell of antiseptic and warmed air. He understood it because the room was too still for weather. The second thing he understood was pain. It sat in his right leg like a live iron bar. His chest burned with every shallow breath. There was a heavy ache low in his ribs, another in his shoulder, and a rawness in his throat that told him he had taken more creek water into his lungs than anyone would ever choose to remember. He opened his eyes to a pale room and a winter afternoon thinned by blinds. Then he turned his head a fraction and saw Fun. The dog lay on a folded blanket against the wall beneath the window, head up, body tucked in, ears half raised even in sleep. He looked exhausted clear through the bone. His coat, normally sleek with cold weather health, still carried a roughness from the soaking and the stress that followed it. There was dried mud caught in one flank where no one had fully brushed him clean. The old leather collar lay dark against his neck. His eyes opened the moment Brady moved. Finn did not leap. He did not whine. He only rose and came to the side of the bed in 3 quick steps, stopping close enough that Brady could feel the warmth of him before he felt his breath. Brady lifted a weak hand. Finn pressed his muzzle into it once, hard enough to matter. For a long moment, neither of them moved after that. When Dr. Eliza Boone came in a few minutes later, she took in the sight without comment, though something in her face eased. She stood at the foot of the bed in her dark green jacket, with her hair pulled back, looking as tired as she had every right to be. "You're awake," she said. Brady's voice came out thin. "Seems that way. You were lucky." He looked at Fun. "I know." Eliza followed his glance, then checked the chart clipped to the bed rail. "Fractured tibia, bad bruising, water in the lungs, but not as much as we feared. Hypothermia. You've spent 3 days moving in and out of enough sleep to make everyone around you irritable." Brady swallowed once. "You stay?" "No," she said dryly. The dog held the room by force of personality. That almost brought a smile to his face. Almost. Recovery came in pieces, and none of them felt noble. There was no sudden gratitude, no dramatic shift in the soul. There was coughing that left him shaking, a leg that felt heavier than the rest of him, and the dull humiliation of needing help for ordinary things. Brady had spent too much of his life training his body to answer when called. Having it fail him so completely, even for good reason, left a temper in him he kept mostly silent. Finn never left for long. The dog slept when Brady slept, woke when Brady stirred, and watched every person who entered the room with the calm intensity of something that had already seen one vanishing and did not intend to witness another. The nurses learned quickly that Finn was not a pet to be patted absent-mindedly. He tolerated kindness, ignored nonsense, and only settled fully when Brady's hand rested somewhere on him. Neck, shoulder, the thick fur behind one ear. "You can stand down," he murmured. Finn let out one long breath, lowered himself to the floor, and slept so hard his paws twitched in dreams. That small surrender hit Brady harder than any spoken loyalty could have. Outside the hospital room, the mess did not sort itself kindly. There were interviews, county questions, measurements, men in reflective jackets looking at broken sections of bank and reopened channels with the sober faces of people forced to admit that paper had not been enough. Kurt Danner was the first thing to come loose. Once people started looking, they found more than one false shortcut in the work below the branch. Extra fill dumped where it had not been authorized, side cuts half-blocked to speed the line, missing reports, altered logs. Then the old campsite gave up worse things. Chains, veterinary antibiotic bottles not legally sourced, stained blankets, hardware that turned rumor into evidence. The story of the dog Brady had pulled from the roadside no longer sounded like one ugly isolated event. It sounded like part of a pattern. Kurt was exposed for what he was. Dale Rourke did not go down the same way, and that mattered. He did not turn into the villain people wanted because real life had never offered that kind of neatness. He had not beaten the dog. He had not meant for water to threaten homes. What he had done was something more ordinary, and in some ways more dangerous. He had trusted design, timing, and his own authority over the old behavior of the land. He had let a man like Kurt move too quickly because quick work kept projects alive. And when warnings came from outside the approved chain, he had treated them as an inconvenience. That was enough. Enough to break people's trust. Enough to force him to look directly at the damage done by certainty. Mabel Sloan came to see Brady near the end of his first full week upright in bed. She brought no flowers. She brought a folder thick with copies of maps, old notes, and deeds, all tied together with kitchen string. "For the county," she said, setting it on the bedside table. "Or for whichever one of them still knows how to read paper older than himself." Brady looked at the file, then at her. "You're giving it up?" "I'm too old to die clutching proof no one uses." Fun rose when she entered, sniffed her coat cuff once, then sat again. Mabel glanced down at him, and one of the sharp lines around her mouth softened. "He saved your hide," she said. Brady rested back against the pillow. "He did." Mabel looked out the window toward the pale sky beyond town. "Good. About time something on that land learned to keep you where you belong." She left soon after, as people like her always do, before the room could turn sentimental. The weeks that followed changed the town more by gesture than speech. Ben Harlan oversaw the reworking of the creek's side relief line using Mabel's records and newer engineering together. He did not make a performance of it. He simply came out with crews, stakes, and equipment, and did the job right this time. Word moved the way it always does in small places, not in declarations, but in trucks slowing when they passed, in pauses at the feed store, in the absence of certain kinds of laughter. No one came to Brady's cabin later with a grand apology. Instead, when he was discharged and brought home on crutches with his leg in a cast, and his lungs still weak from the cold water, he found a split stack of birch already under the porch overhang. A handrail along the back step had been tightened. The road in had been cleared after the latest snow before he could even think to ask. Someone mended the sagging gate at the far side of the property. Someone else dropped off a pan of venison stew and left before he reached the door. That was how gratitude looked in that country when people were too decent to cheapen it with speeches. Eliza came twice a week at first, sometimes under the proper excuse of checking his breathing or making sure the cast was sitting right. Sometimes because Finn had thrown himself so fully into that freezing water and the frantic days after it that he needed watching, too. The dog had strained his shoulder, lost weight, and carried a deeper fatigue than Brady liked to see. Eliza treated both of them with the same practical firmness. "Neither of you is invincible," she said one afternoon while Finn endured a careful examination with stoic annoyance. "One of you just has the good sense not to argue with me." Brady sat at the table, one leg stretched out awkwardly, and looked at Fun. "He's learning." "No," Eliza said. "He chose well." After she left, Brady sat for a long time by the cabin window with Fun lying across the floorboards near the stove. The creek moved beyond the glass, no longer hidden by the same kind of tension as before. Winter had begun to soften toward its edge. Light lingered longer into evening. The repaired line of the relief branch caught the sun in a different way now, less like a scar than a reopening. For the first time since he had bought the place, Brady had no real work he could do with his hands. That left him with thinking. He had come north to end something quietly. Not his life, but the part of it that belonged to other people's needs. He had wanted a roof, wood heat, distance, and the right not to be drawn into anyone else's trouble. Yet lying still with a ruined leg propped on a chair and the creek running below the window, he could finally see how thin that wish had always been. A dying shepherd on a snow road, a half-frozen puppy, an old woman who remembered where water used to go, a veterinarian who kept showing up without demanding explanation, a road foreman willing at the right hour to trust a man instead of a file. He had not built a wall around himself after all. He had wandered into a place where things had been handed to him one by one until he had no decent way left to refuse them. By the time the cast came off and the crutches became a cane, spring had already passed into another lean autumn. Then winter came back again, cleaner this time. On a cold afternoon under a pale sky, Brady made his way out to the rise above the creek where the shepherd mother had been buried in that first brutal season. He carried a small wooden marker he had cut and smoothed himself in the shed, the edges sanded by hand, because some acts deserve time even when no one else would see them. Finn went ahead, then slowed and waited. He was fully grown now, broad in the chest, steady in the eye. All the uncertainty of his early body turned into strength. When Brady reached the grave, Finn did not sniff or circle. He simply stood beside it, still and alert, as if he understood exactly what place this was and what had begun there long before he had words for it. Brady set the marker into the frozen earth with the help of a mallet and both gloved hands. He did not make a promise aloud. The land had heard enough promises from men. He only stood there beside the grave, breathing steam into the cold, looking down at the bright strip of creek below where the water ran in the path it should have been allowed to keep all along. This place was no longer where he had come to disappear. It was where he had chosen to remain. The last image belongs to the winter after that. Light falls clear across the repaired creek. The new wooden footbridge, simple and strong, crosses the narrow point above the reopened side run. Snow rests on the rails in neat white bands. Finn moves ahead over the planks with the easy confidence of a dog that knows every inch of this ground and takes none of it for granted. Halfway across, he stops and looks back, not impatient, only checking. Brady comes after him more slowly now. The old injury still in his gait when the cold settles deep, but steady. Neither of them is alive because they were rescued once. They are alive because at the right hour each held the other long enough for the rest of life to become worth keeping. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest changes in our lives do not begin with strength. They begin with compassion. Brady thought he was buying a quiet piece of land so he could disappear from the world. But God placed a wounded mother dog and one fragile little life in his path. And through that moment, Brady was called back into purpose. What looked like an interruption was, in truth, a kind of mercy. The lesson is simple but powerful. We do not always meet God only in churches, prayers, or perfect moments. Sometimes we meet him in responsibility, in suffering, in the choice to stop when others keep walking, in the quiet feeling that says, "This life has been placed in your hands for a reason." And sometimes the miracle is not that pain never comes. Sometimes the miracle is that God sends exactly what we need to keep going, even if it first arrives in the form of a burden, a wounded creature, or a road we never planned to take. In everyday life, many of us are tired. Many of us carry old grief, disappointments, regrets, or silent loneliness. We may believe we are only trying to survive, only trying to get through one more season. But this story reminds us that love can still find us there. Purpose can still find us there. And God can still use even the broken places in our lives to protect someone else, heal something in us, and lead us toward a future we did not know we still had. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments. What part stayed with you the most? And what lesson did you take from Brady and Fun's journey? I would truly love to hear your thoughts. And if stories like this speak to you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who may need hope today. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, comfort your burdens, and guide your steps with peace, mercy, and quiet courage in the days ahead.